All right, welcome to Startups Ignite Impact Interviews. I have Mike Ravenscroft here today, and we're going to talk about seed funding. We're going to talk about a lot of things. Mike, can you tell us who you are, what you're passionate about, and what role do you play in this startup community?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks so much, Callie, for having me on the show. Really a pleasure to be here. My name is Mike, and I am the managing director of the Maryland Momentum Fund. And the Maryland Momentum Fund is the University System of Maryland's seed stage venture fund. I'll talk a little bit more about what that implies in a minute. As far as your first question about what I'm passionate about helping founders. I got into venture capital initially running accelerator programs. I met a founder based in San Diego who was building a technology solution for firefighters. He's still a good friend of mine today. And I realized, and I sort of asked him this question, wait, you figured out there's a problem, you built a solution, you raised some money, and you turned that into a business, and now you're raising more money, and that's what you do for a living? Oh yeah, I want to do that. And so I've been working with founders for the last 7 or 8 years in my career, and I'm very passionate about helping very early stage founders figure out their direction, go-to-market strategy, fundraising strategy, and helping them get products and great ideas, turn them into products, turning them into a market opportunity. So what role do I play in the ecosystem? What role does Momentum Fund play in the ecosystem? So we're a Maryland-based investor, and we are similar to organizations like TEDCO in Maryland in the sense that we are investing in Maryland companies that are, companies that are headquartered in Maryland. We're primarily a technology investor, but we do invest outside of sort of the realm of traditional tech startups. The requirement for us and what our mandate is as a fund is to invest in ventures that are going to create value for Maryland, for the University of Maryland system and its stakeholders, and for the various folks that play into that broader ecosystem. So as a fund, I mentioned we're a seed stage investor. We're typically investing between $150,000 and $350,000 as our first check-in on a financing round. We're typically participating alongside angels, angel groups, seed stage venture funds. These are typically companies that are maybe actively working on an SBIR or maybe post-SBIR. We typically are looking at technology companies, but we also look at companies that are doing other things like food, direct-to-consumer. We'll really take a look at anything as long as it meets one of three criteria. So the first and most obvious for us is we're funding companies that are founded by Maryland alums. And when I say Maryland, I mean the system of Maryland. So the University System of Maryland is 12 colleges and universities. It is 3 research ones: University of Maryland College Park, University of Maryland Baltimore County, University of Maryland Baltimore, where I'm an employee, and then many other fantastic colleges and universities, HBCUs. So it's a very diverse system, whole lot of innovation that comes out of it in the form of alums who are founders. And we're typically investing in companies that have a founding alum on the cap table, maybe more than one. It's not rare. In fact, it's quite common that some people do their undergrad at Towson, grad at Maryland College Park, start a company. We're looking for those founders that are affiliated directly with the university system. The second bucket that we're looking at in terms of types of companies we invest in is technology that is being transferred out of the university system and commercialized by a startup. Oftentimes, the inventor or the founder has some other affiliation with Maryland, but not always. The founder or the inventor does. The C-suite running the startup may or may not have a Maryland affiliation, but if they're exclusively licensing technology from the university system, then we can invest in that company. And then the third bucket, which is sort of more an outlier for us in terms of how our portfolio is made up, but we can also invest in companies that are headquartered in one of our office parks, research facilities. For example, the University of Maryland Biopark, which is in Baltimore, a world-class research facility, office space for biotech startups primarily. We can invest in companies that have a headquarters in an office that is within one of our RISE zones, we call them, or in one of the university buildings. For the most part, our companies fall into the first two buckets. So as far as where we see our role, it's really being a catalyzer of innovation in terms of that stakeholder base. So along with TEDCO, along with angel groups, individual angels, seed stage venture funds in the region, we're really looking to help Maryland companies add fuel to the fire early on and get from what is very challenging pre-seed or seed stage through to a Series A with our investment. So that's who we are and how we work.
There's a lot to cover here, and I want to pull out some gems because what you do and what the broader Maryland ecosystem does is a really great example that I want to pull nationwide for early stage startups. Is one, you and I have talked about this. There is a lie that we tell ourselves, that I see a lot of emerging tech companies tell themselves, that it's this idea, and then I'm going to go to New York. I'm going to go to Silicon Valley, and that's where I'm going to raise the money or there just isn't the resources. When in reality, Maryland, Virginia, DC, the DMV does this very well. Go to look at your state and go and look at the programs that they're associated with. You'll see local, you'll see regional, and then you'll see national support all the way filtered down, sometimes to your city even, but certainly to your college. I'd just like you to explain a little bit about this, overcoming that bias or that blind spot that people have. The amount of resources that are available locally, it trumps what people think of nationally so often. Have you found that you're a hidden gem? Like, oh my God, you're right in my backyard. I thought I was going to have to get on a plane, and then Mike saves the day. Do you have that conversation?
Well, since somebody's told me I've saved the day, but I appreciate what you're saying. And in all seriousness, I hear this a lot. And I think that this is, like you said, I think that this is a myth that's probably in the process of being busted, I would think, given what's going on in the broader like macro and in the market more generally. But it's true. I mean, there's this perception that Maryland's not a good place to launch and scale a company because the money just isn't here. I think that's an excuse. And I think that it's consistently disproven by companies that have successly built businesses here for a couple of reasons. And for one thing, money is not everything. Money is a means to hire talent. That's what most startup proceeds go towards. It's not paying your AWS costs. It's paying for people and hiring people. And Maryland has, I won't rattle off all the statistics, but leading the nation in STEM grads, fantastic bed of talent from a university system that covers a lot of ground in terms of the types of grads that we're graduating. There are some of the best AI engineers, quantum engineers, bleeding edge technologies are right here in Maryland. It's fine to go to Silicon Valley and try to raise money, but then you got to compete with the Googles and the Apples and everybody else throwing millions of dollars at software engineers a year. That $5 million round doesn't go nearly as far out there. That, I think, is sort of the misperception that, it's easy to raise money and then it's easy to build a company out west or in Austin or in Boston. I think the talent base really does matter there. And I don't think you can extrapolate, or I don't think you can extricate that from this question of raising money. As far as how very early stage companies get funded, absolutely the case. So Maryland also leads the nation by many metrics in terms of federal funding and then state grants that are awarded to early stage startups. It's a huge amount of state, and then by extension, federal money that flows to Maryland to fund very early stage, very high risk, but potentially revolutionary technology ventures. So the SBIR program is one. The Small Business Development Center has a number of support services. TEDCO does a grant program, the MII program, which many of your listeners are probably familiar with. There are all these grant programs that are either being run by Maryland or administered by Maryland, or that are federal dollars flowing to Maryland companies. There's no shortage of early stage funding in Maryland. I think the challenge is that Maryland doesn't tend to have the base of exited entrepreneurs that are writing early stage angel checks. And I think that's something that there's a lot more of that on the West Coast. There is a great angel scene in Maryland. I will say certainly a good place to raise angel money, but it does not really compare on the order of magnitude that you would see in Silicon Valley, where there's lots of exited entrepreneurs that built their businesses in software and want to invest in software companies. Like a lot of the angels in Maryland, Mid-Atlantic, they are not necessarily software entrepreneurs. They built government contracting businesses. They are wealthy in some other respect. And so sometimes that disconnect can be challenging. One thing I will say, though, is that I do think that COVID really, I mean, this is kind of like trite to say at this point because COVID changed everything. But COVID, I think, really did change the dynamic for seed stage companies. I don't think it's happening nearly as much as it used to that companies are moving to find money. Like, right. I think that, and if only because I've met a lot of West Coast investors that are just fine investing in a Maryland company because the valuations are lower, the expectations are more realistic, and the talent pool is there such that companies don't need to blow through $10 million to do what you could with 2 or 2.5. So that's kind of a general statement, but I do think that trend has encouraged companies not to feel like they have to uproot and go somewhere looking for money, which may or may not be a good idea anyway.
Yeah, for sure. If you're going to be in cybersecurity, you're going to be in medical or some branches of hard tech, this is the area to be in anyways. We have the highest concentration of smart people in those fields anywhere. So long term, it's going to be about your team. It's not going to be about first money in. But you did mention SBIRs really quickly. And so there's alternative funding to come in before a program like yours or afterwards. we're also finding that this area, because every trade organization is here, every NGO is here, every agency and large company has a footprint here. If we focus on impact, if we focus on the human value of the problem that we solve, we're getting pilot partnerships and we're getting early actual revenue in to startups, which positions you really well. Anybody wants to invest in someone that already has a $100,000 contract or a pilot with a prime contractor in place or another large organization. It just makes good sense. A lot of the due diligence is done for you by the fact that you're revenue positive and a large company is vouching
willing
for
to
you.
pay for what you're selling. Yeah.
Yeah. And so from that regard, and I know people are listening to this, not just in the DC metro area, but we live in a purposely pragmatic area. And long term, I feel that really supports founders well, because it's harder to get spun out of control with easy money, which isn't there anymore anyways, let's be honest. But adjacent to the SBIR conversation, I want to talk about tech transfer, because you said something really interesting about the university system. And this is a fact that I'm very passionate about myself, because people love their ideas. They're willing to sacrifice their life over ideas that have randomly occurred to them. But when I talk to them, and I love ideas, I do product development, right? I'm an idea realization person.
Yeah.
But the fact is that more than 90% of all intellectual property is not commercialized. And every time I talk to a university or I talk to a community, we're filled with good ideas. We're overflowing with good ideas, to the point where, as an entrepreneur, if I want to improve my idea, I want to go to the school and talk to people. But you said something about maybe it's not directly tech transfer, but just commercializing those ideas or supporting those founders coming out of universities.
Sure.
And that strikes a chord with me.
Yeah, I can talk more about that. So
yeah,
it's one of the pillars of our fund. It's one of our mandates. There is a whole lot of innovation happening within not just our research ones, but within all of the colleges and universities in the system. There are faculty that are working on ideas that they want to turn into products, that they want to turn into businesses. We talk a lot in startup land, startup world about valleys of death. One of the very real and apparent valleys of death is the point at which IP is maybe like a decade of money and research and time has gone into developing a piece of intellectual property, whether that's a biotechnology asset, whether it's a medical device, whether it's anything that is much higher risk, but potentially, much greater promise in terms of the kind of technology or the kind of product that it could become. That's typically what universities tend to do, like very high risk, potentially very high reward. Once that patent is granted, once that tries to step outside of the four walls of the institution, you're asking a lot of a very early stage investor to take a chance on something that's very, very high risk. The government and the SBIR programs and various other programs that fund early stage research, they're great at taking big shots at very high risk, but potentially revolutionary technologies. The challenge, I think, is that building the IP and transitioning out of the university is one thing. Building and scaling a company it's an entirely different skill set. So if it's a faculty member or an inventor that wants to take the reins of the company, that doesn't happen all that often, honestly. Usually the inventors maintain like an advisory role with the company. And that's not to say that they can't run a company, but it takes a very different skill set. And running a business is extremely different and differently difficult than running a lab at a university. And so finding a team, finding a company that you can form that can help commercialize technology, that maybe brings in talent outside of the university to build a balanced team around the faculty member or the researcher or the staff member that created the technology. That, I think, is very, very hard to do. It's really hard to build teams, even in the best case scenario, but it's much harder to try to do that while you're also raising money and doing all these other things. So for us as a fund, one of our goals, like I said, we're trying to be a catalyst and bringing other investors to the table, helping companies find other sources of funding. And I think that the truth is just that grants can only do so much for you. As much as I love the SBIR programs and the MLI program and all of the other grant opportunities that are available to early stage companies, you can't do marketing and sales. Those funds, they're for R&D, which is critical. But you almost always need other outside capital to be able to support a company and the sort of infrastructure that goes along with building a business. So that I think is where there's generally this gap of people willing to, funds, institutions willing to take an early shot. I think foundations can do a lot there too. There's always a point where a company needs to start raising money. And often that's from angel investors, angel groups, pre-seed funds, seed funds. And that's where we try to play a catalytic role. We try to help companies find other investors, bring other people to the table. One of the things I forgot to mention at the top, which I probably should have, is that we're a matching fund. Unlike Tedco or any other fund or an angel that could set terms, issue a term sheet, we don't do that. And that's by design. We're a small fund. We're not writing huge checks. We want to find other investors to lead rounds, set terms. We participate on those terms. We also have to have companies raise matching capital. It offsets the risk for us, but it also encourages companies to go out and raise from other sources in addition to ourselves. So there's no, and I could probably ramble on and stop me, but I will say it's different depending on the technology. Mm-hmm. So often it's the case that we're working with biotech companies, which are years out from revenue. Other times it's software, which is much closer to revenue, might even be revenue positive by the time it moves out of the university. So what every company needs as a result is going to be very, very different, particularly depending on what type technology vertical they're operating in.
Yeah, it makes sense. With hard tech, certainly even the SBIR, you're not going to get far enough along where you're revenue positive and building inventory and building out the actual execution level team that you need. But it's nice to know that those opportunities are lined up, that there's someone to go pitch to get validated. There's programs out there to get 10K, 20K, 50K. There's people who are willing to angel invest. There's programs that are willing to give us a 6-figure check. And if we can line up those opportunities logically, we can create a funding path to do whatever needs to get done, right? It doesn't matter the industry. So it's great as long as you know where it fits in that model, right?
Yeah. And I'll say one thing that I've learned since starting this job is just how much the tech transfer landscape has really evolved in the last maybe 20, 25 years. It used to be the case that Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, all these other massive pharmaceutical companies would have very close direct relationships with the universities, and they would talk with PIs. They would maybe be funding labs. Some of that still happens. But it used to be the case that they would license technology much closer to when it comes out of the university. So much closer to the phase of exploratory R&D, early animal data, positive results, tracking well. Let's acquire this or license it and bring it through phase 1. That doesn't happen so much anymore. It is now much more likely that those larger pharma companies have their own venture funds, or they have licensing agreements that sort of kick in around the phase 1, maybe even after that, because they don't want to license, but they won't take it off the company's hands. There'll still be a startup that's running the trial, that's working with the CRO, that's doing all that other stuff. But there's just this risk aversion around. It is no longer the case that enterprises want to acquire or license R&D. They want product. They want something that is much further along. And so I think that's become the added challenge, is that it's a lot harder for tech transfer, and then companies that are formed around IP that's been transferred out, to get the attention of large industry when they maybe 20 years ago would have had much less problem doing so. Mm-hmm. Like that's where there's this added emphasis and importance for academic institutions to continue to fund the most promising of those ventures, because otherwise they very well may struggle. And then, at that point, it doesn't matter what royalty agreement you have with the company. If it doesn't go anywhere, then you don't get any royalty and the patent goes away or gets pulled back to the institution. So
that makes sense.
That's the thing that I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah. For me in hardware, that's normal. And in defense hardware, that's absolutely normal. It's generally investment looks like acquiring your small business, but yeah, it's interesting to see how those markets move. I think it would be nice to share some case studies or some wins that you have coming out of your portfolio, or somebody that you'd like to brag about as an example.
I could brag about my companies all day long. I think what is fascinating about Maryland as a state and the system as a collection of very diverse inputs in the form of universities and the folks that are graduating from them and the work for them is just the sheer variety of companies that I get the opportunity to take a look at and that we get the opportunity to fund. So I'll call out a couple. We reinvested very recently in a Baltimore-based company called Sunstone Credit. So they just raised a $20 million Series A. from a number of strategics, growth tech capital, great funds, very active in the region, invest in the last round, invest in this round. And they do basically a credit financing platform for SMBs that want to go solar. I previously did not honestly associate Maryland with clean tech. It is increasingly becoming a clean tech destination. There's a whole lot of interest in whether that's aqua tech, marine culture, or aquaculture, or traditional green tech, clean tech. There are a number of algae companies that are headquartered in Maryland to do feedstock and like large scale algae operations. So that's one that I'll draw attention to, Sunstone Credit. We invested a number of years ago in a very early stage therapeutic called Verilox. They are a local Baltimore success story now. They've raised a couple of rounds of capital. They're about to enter phase 2 trials. Very exciting company and a wonderful founding team. And there are a couple of deals that we have in the pipeline that I can't speak to because they're not announced yet. But I will just say that the thing that strikes me as being really worth drawing attention to is the fact that all of the founders in our portfolio and that we have the opportunity to invest in, we're generally looking at team first. Like as a seed stage investor, there's always this question of, is it the jockey? Is it the horse? Is it the great team or the great technology?
There's not much horse there. You got to look at the jockey, right?
Yeah. And I heard a VC say recently, and this was a West Coast VC, like a manager of a $150 million fund. He said, I always back A+ teams with B+ ideas because invariably the B+ team doesn't execute on A+ technology, right? But an A+ team can make anything work. And so for our portfolio, I won't say, who the favorites are because I don't pick favorites, but they are all spectacular entrepreneurs. They have variety of experiences, skill sets, inputs that they're bringing to the table. For the most part, extremely diverse teams, which is something that I'm very happy about and think is worth drawing attention to. And also, like I said, extremely diverse businesses. The most recent new investment we announced is a company called Marino Life. This is a team that, it was a product that was around for a number of years in a different form, changed forms. The founder was a Salisbury University graduate and then did his executive MBA at College Park and came up with this sort of different way of thinking about his business that he'd already been running and then turned that into this. It's basically a platform that connects marinas, boating enthusiasts, basically like tech-enabled solution, making that relationship much more productive and streamlining the ocean-going experience or the life on the water, I think they call it. But it was a great example, though, of how the university system influenced the entrepreneur to think about the business. It was like a part of his capstone project at Maryland. And then a couple of years later, we get the opportunity to invest in the business and help them grow. And the CEO is herself an entrepreneur. She worked for another local Baltimore company and scaled it before joining Marino Life. I think the advantage of having the platform that we do is that we're able to contribute in these kind of different ways to these companies. And ultimately, it's the founders are the ones making them successful. We're just helping nudge them along and giving them some resources and capital to enable them to do that.
Wow. Mike, before we go, where's the best place that people can learn more about Maryland Momentum Fund, maybe follow you and follow up on some of those wins?
Absolutely. We have a wonderful and detailed website. It's if you just Google Maryland Momentum Fund, it comes right up. And so we have an online application portal where folks can just send us their decks. I schedule a call with pretty much every founder that sends a deck our way, as long as there's a university system connection. One of the things I didn't mention before is we try to be helpful too for companies that are considering a fundraise or are sort of pre-fundraise. I always like to talk to founders if they're considering raising capital or if they are building a venture that we might want to take a look at in like 6 or 12 months time when they're ready for a seed round. So take calls with founders all day long. So the founders can submit their pitch decks on our website. They can reach out to me directly. My email is on the website. They can also hit me up on LinkedIn. Try to stay very active on LinkedIn and responding to requests that I get.
Fantastic. Hey, thanks for the time today. It's always great to catch up. But everybody that's listening, here's my top takeaways is look for your local programs, reach out to people like Mike, and understand that there are opportunities for every stage, including seed, pre-seed. There's probably support in your local city, your school, your county, your state that will help you move that one step forward and put you in a better place into their network for the subsequent steps. So
couldn't agree more.
All right.
Thanks for having me on, Kelly.
Thank you. Fun.